I'm recording now because I am recording now. I am Lauren B. Davis. We're going to put this up on the web later, so anybody who missed it can watch it. If any of your friends couldn't be here tonight but would still like to see it, they shall be able to. So back to that. So I'm Lauren. My friend Dawn Cohen, who is also on the call tonight, and I have put this course together. We think there's going to be, well, at least 9 to begin with, and then we'll see how it goes. If we get participants and you guys are interested and teachers are willing to teach, then we may just keep going. I'm going to yak for a while tonight about, as I said, about my novel, The Grimoire of Kensington Market, and how folk and fairy tales informed that book and my writing of it. And then I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about one of my favorite tales, which is The Handless Maiden, and fairy tales in general, and about how you can use them to deepen your work and even to inspire you. The internet, as some of you may have noticed, since the world has gone to hell in a handbasket, has sometimes been acting up, and I often get these bad internet connections. If it freezes, I'm sorry. There's not a damn thing I can do about it. I just hope it will unfreeze. And as soon as I notice it freezing, I will stop talking, and hopefully we can get back to it. Oh yes. Now the other thing is, this course is free, and it will continue to be free. However, if you would like to donate something in any amount, we would be most grateful. I'm not going to be taking any money from this at all. I'm in a very lucky position that I don't need it right now, but that is not true of all the writers who are offering these courses.
I don't hear you. Okay.
Entirely up to them. And the connection has become unstable. Hopefully it's back again. Yes, thank you, David. Okay, so I think then we talked about next classes. Hassan Santur is teaching on Saturday morning at 10, The Art of the Novel. And then we have Lori on next Thursday, this time, who will be teaching on memoir. We have Lucy Dawes, who's coming to us from England and is going to be teaching on the short story. She's won all kinds of awards, fascinating woman. And then we have Mel, who's going to be teaching on editing. We have David, who's on this call and is going to be talking to us about science writing and how to form research and pitch articles, especially in this difficult time. So I think that's about it for all of the house cleaning stuff. Yes, I'm seeing that some people are saying they've lost sound. It does come back, I hope. I'm sorry, it's not me, it's the interwebby. Okay, so The Grimoire of Kensington Market. Some of you may have read it, some of you may not. It's the story, it's based on or was inspired by, and this is not the fun part, the death by suicide of both of my brothers. And after my second brother killed himself, one brother killed himself on Easter Sunday, and the other killed himself 12 years later on Good Friday. I'm sure there was some symbolism in that. But I found myself, obviously deeply distraught. And being a writer, I wanted to write about it somehow. The problem was I couldn't figure out a way to do it. It was too dark. It was too emotional for me. I didn't feel safe writing about it. I started writing it as a memoir that I simply could not do. Then I started to write it as realistic fiction, and I simply couldn't do that. It was, every time I tried to approach it, it just seemed more and more impossible. And quite frankly, I was getting more and more distressed by it. It wasn't helping in the least. So I put it away for a while, as writers do. And I spent a lot of time walking the beach and doing a lot of reading. And then I started doing what I love to do, which is to read fairy tales. I've always loved to read fairy and folk tales. I find them full of deep wisdom. And I knew a woman years ago, a Welsh woman, Joey Bishop, who was a storyteller. And she had this beautiful collection of fairy tales. And when she went back to Ireland, she left me all of her collection of folk and fairy tales on the condition that I would do something with them one day. And so I've been using them as research ever since. So as I was reading all of these stories, and I found myself obviously being drawn to stories that were about brothers and sisters, I came across Hans Christian Andersen's story, and the Snow Queen, the Snow Queen. And I'm hoping most of you have read that. I did put a link up on the site, but often I think, people have already heard of that story. But it's about a little girl who loses her best friend because he's taken away by the Snow Queen into a land in the far north. And there are demons who make a mirror, and the mirror, it transposes the way everything looks, so that everything that's beautiful looks ugly and everything that's ugly looks beautiful. So it becomes this change of perception. And because both my brothers died, yes, of suicide, but as a result of drug and alcohol addiction, I thought, well, what better symbol is there? What better metaphor is there for addiction than this mirror that changes the way, this piece of ice that gets in your heart, that gets in your eyes, and changes the way you view the world? Because those of us who are in recovery, as I am, we often talk about addiction being a disease of perception. And so that suddenly that sort of twigged with me, and I thought, oh, now that's something, put that away, put that aside, make a note. And as I kept reading it, this little girl, she goes into this other world to try and rescue her brother. But like all fairy tales, it's very strictly structured. In fairy tales, as I'm sure many of you know, lots of things happen in threes, 3 wishes, 3 tasks, and lots of things happen in 7s. And so in this book, there are 7 specific stories. In fact, the way Andersen wrote it was first story, and that story is all about the demons and the mirror and the shattering of the mirror and how it flies out into the world and goes into people's hearts and eyes. And then there's a story of when the little girl first goes into the next world to try and find her brother, and then there are 6 more tales until she finally finds him in the home of the Ice Queen in the far north. And I have always hated the ending of that story. Hans Christian Andersen was deeply Christian, which is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But the ending of that particular story is very saccharine to me, and I think probably to modern tastes. The little boy is lost on lost in this world of ice, and there's a broken mirror on the floor, and he's trying to put it together, and it spells out something about how Jesus loves you, and it's it just always went. So I knew that if I was going to use this, I was going to use the message behind it. I was going to use some of the symbols behind it. But most importantly, I was going to use that structure. Because as I said, I felt so unsafe psychologically writing about this event in the life of my family, that every time I got into it, it was like I was stepping into quicksand. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't know if I could keep my head above it all. However, when I found that structure of 7, I felt safe. I thought, okay, I can take this idea of addiction, I can transpose it into a modern world, and I can take this idea of an altered perception and use that as one of the symbols of addiction. But then I can also start to play, because it is after all a fairy tale, with space and time. Because I think one of the things that happens with addiction, and I wasn't quite sure in realistic fiction how to portray this, is that addiction changes not only the person who's addicted and their immediate family, but it changes the larger family. It changes the neighborhood. It changes your town. Down here in the States, there are huge swaths of the country that are just in desperate straits because of the opioid crisis. It travels. It changes everything. And so in the book, space begins to change. As the drug becomes more widespread, space begins to truncate. And that again is a perception thing, right? And then of course, when she goes into this other world, there are a series of things that she must find, that she must do, and more importantly, that she has to understand her inner knowing to get to the end, where she finds her brother in this snow, this ice castle. But I also thought what a wonderful image for addiction the Snow Queen herself was. I mean, she's the drug, you know, and she is very much, if you read the Hans Christian Andersen, there is something very druggy about her. I mean, she's very beautiful and she's cold and icy, but she's alluring and lives in this magical place and promises all sorts of things. And that's very much what, you know, one's drug of choice does if you fall into that deep relationship with it. So Srebrenka, as is her name in the book, became not only you know, the antagonist, but she also becomes not only a physical antagonist, but the embodiment of the drug itself, right? So, I mean, all of that to say, I've had people come to me over the years and say, I don't know what to write about. I don't know how to write about, you know, what I want to write about. And I'm always saying to them, go find a fairy tale. Go find a folk tale. Start reading fairy and folk tales, because there's something really old about the knowledge that is contained there. And the other thing about fairy tales that I find so fascinating is that because the characters in them are often sort of two-dimensional, right? They don't really have much past. They don't have much of an inner life. You know, it's sort of the princess who was born in the castle, the you know, the youngest son who must go off on a quest somewhere. That it enables you, if you're working on characters and you can't figure out, you know, what their symbols might be, what their next step might be, it allows you to superimpose on this rather cardboard figure something that is much more malleable. You know, you can play with it in a lot more ways, and it becomes a jumping off point. So, you know, although I always, you know, tell my writing students that you know, you have to know your characters really, really well before you start writing about them. And in fact, you know, you probably have to know your characters back to their grandparents, even if none of the grandparents ever appear in the book, right? But you have to know what's in their bedside table, and, you know, you have to know so much about them. But there is sometimes a point where you think you know all that stuff, but you still don't have a sense of what they're yearning for, you know, what the journey is. And that's often where in the themes of what you're working on, folk and fairy tales can be so incredibly important. Does that make sense to everybody? Let me unmute you for a minute and see. And so, okay, you're all unmuted. Don't all talk at once. But does that make sense to some of you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it back on mute. Thank you. What I'd like you to do, because you all talk at once and the whole thing starts doing this, what I'd like you to do is if you have a question, why don't you type it in the chat? Is everybody's chat open? Do they know how to do that? If you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you will see mute and stop video and invite and manage, and then you will see a little chat button. So I've got a couple here going on, yep, they get it, understood, wonderful, okay.
It's orange.
Mine's not, mine's white, but yours might be orange, David, you are special.
And perhaps also, if people, you know, who are on video, unlike me, can nod, maybe that will also be a cue to you that we're getting it.
We're getting it, thumbs up from those who are on video, okay. So, my husband also came in to give me the thumbs up. My tech guy says we're doing good. Okay. So are there any questions that I can answer before we go on to the next part? I'm going to wait a second because it takes a minute for people to type in. I must be really good because there's no questions. Okay, I will go on. Okay, so let's talk then. I'm hoping I'm going to just need to find a fairy tale. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I see that. Okay. So let's talk for a minute about the Handmaid's Tale. And again, I'm hoping you've had a chance to read this because it's going to make a lot more sense if you have. But The Handmaid's Tale is a fascinating story for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a Celtic tale, which is a lot of my history, so I'm drawn to it. But Celtic tales are a little bit different than some of the Nordic tales, for example, in that they're often a little more convoluted. And they sometimes have second parts and, you know, they trail off into various directions. And The Handmaid's Tale is certainly one of those. I'll just go over it really quickly in case you haven't read it. And so The Handmaid's Tale begins with a man going into market one day, and there he meets another man who, as often happens in fairy tales, turns out to be the devil. And the devil says to him, look, I'll give you just about everything you want, lots of money, lots of fame, and lots of good houses and food and stuff like that, if you'll just give me what's under the apple tree behind your house. And so I think it was a miller, yes, the miller, who is, let's say, not the smartest miller in the village, says, well, can there be behind, you know, under the apple tree except a bunch of dirt? So sure, it's yours. He gets home, he tells his wife, he's all excited because poof, they've got this fabulous house all of a sudden. And she goes, well, how did you get this? And he said, well, I gave him, you know, I gave this guy whatever was underneath the apple tree. And she goes, oh my God, our daughter was underneath the apple tree. Oh, bad music, right? So he goes out to tell the daughter what he's done. And she, you know, honoring her father because she is a very good girl, she says, you know, she will do whatever her father needs. And then the devil arrives. And she realizes how dangerous this is, and she does not want to go. It's terrible, and she begins marking herself all up and putting dirt on her. And he said, I'm not going to take her like that. She's filthy. Make her wash. And so she starts washing and washing and washing and washing and washing. But as she's washing, of course, she becomes purer and more clean and more lovely. And so the devil comes back and says, you got to make her stop washing, because if she's going to be that pure and clean and lovely, I can't take her. So the devil says, the only thing to do now is just cut off her hands, which is, of course, a leap, but it's a fairy tale, so there you go. So the miller comes to the daughter and says, I have to cut off your hands. And she goes, well, that's really unfortunate, Dad, but I do love you, so off you go. So he cuts off her hands. Okay. And then she runs into the forest by herself, away from this horrible, horrible man who doesn't really want somebody who even without hands, is so pure and beautiful and lovely. Because in fairy tales, beauty and goodness always have great power, sometimes even more power than the devil. So off she goes into the forest. But she can't feed herself because, as we mentioned, no hands. So an angel comes to her. Now, in many of the versions, you know, it's quite Christianized. In the oldest of versions, one suspects it wasn't an angel, but a spirit or an old woman of the woods or a dryad or a naiad or somebody. But it's, you know, in the story that I know, it was an angel. And so the angel comes to her and says, look, there's a really great garden just over that river there. And in that garden, there are some really, really good pears. They are delicious pears. They are the best pears around. Problem is that the king really loves his pears. And so he counts the pears every night. And so you just can't go in and take a pear whenever you feel like it. But I'll turn myself into a hind, little deer, and at night, and you can get on my back. We'll go across the river, and you know, I'll help you get the pears. So he does. They do this, and she trusts the angel because, of course, she recognizes goodness. So the king's man comes out, and he sees this handless person, you know, nibbling like a little deer from these pears. And he knows he's going to get in trouble because there's a pear missing. So he goes to the king and says, gee, king, you should see what's going on here. There's this angel thing and this really pretty girl, and she's got no hands and she's eating. So the king, being a good king and not an ill judge, comes out to watch this girl at night, and immediately, of course, falls in love with her, hands or no hands, and takes her home and marries her. And when he marries her, being a guy, you know, he thinks, well, this hand stuff, that's a problem. So I'm going to make you beautiful silver hands. So he does. He makes her beautiful silver hands. And that's lovely and nice and everything. So then she gets pregnant. Now, while she's pregnant, and this is where, you see, ordinarily the story would have kind of stopped there, but ordinarily is not what happens in this story. Now the king has a wife he adores, a baby on the way, but war breaks out. And so he must go off to war, leaving his lovely wife, soon to give birth, in the care of his mother. And he says, whatever you do, take care of her, and I'll keep in touch by mail. Fine. He goes off to war. It's a terrible, terrible war. Awful things are happening. His mother writes to him and says, your wife is in labor and about to have a child. He sends word back with a page, and the page halfway there falls asleep. As he falls asleep, the devil, who's not been particularly thrilled that he didn't get this girl when he wanted her, and has been watching what's been going on, sneaks up on the page, takes the letter and changes it and says, throw her out. I don't want her anymore. Toss her out. Well, the mother doesn't want to do that. So she says, well, he'll change his mind, when the baby's born, right? So she sends another note and says, oh, beautiful boy is born, absolutely gorgeous. Everybody's fine. You should be so happy. Same thing happens. Second note goes out. Devil takes it, intervenes, changes the wording and says, kill her. Kill the baby. Kill the woman. Kill my wife. So the mother is completely distraught. She can't imagine what's happened to her son, why war has made him this horrible person. But she figures she's got to do something. So she takes a deer, and it's fairy tales, right? So takes out the deer's eyeballs and the tongue and leaves them for her her son when he comes back, and says to the queen, take your baby and run. Can't bear to kill you. You're just too lovely. So off she runs, and now she's back in the forest. Silver hands or no, baby in the forest. And there she wanders and wanders and wanders until she comes upon an old lady in the wood. And the old lady in the wood takes her in, raises the child, who is named Filled with Grief. And as she lives with the woman, her hands grow back in the midst of the healing of this forest. In the meantime, the husband comes home and says, where's my wife? And the mother goes, what are you talking about? You said kill her. And so they then realize what's happened and what a terrible thing it's been. And the man is completely riven with guilt and love. And knowing this is all his fault and that he's probably sent his wife out to die, she'll starve. He says, I will neither eat nor drink until I find her. And off he goes into the woods, where he spends 7 years wandering, trying to find her. And of course, because he is a good man of a good heart, God doesn't let him starve to death. But he neither eats nor drinks. Finally, he finds his wife. Well, he finds the old woman, and she says, yeah, I think I got somebody you might want to see. Brings out the woman, but she has her hands. And he says, how, what are you talking about? This can't be my wife. And brings the baby, and here's your child. Here is Filled with Grief. And she says, well, how can this be that your hands grow back? And she explains then that it was in the healing of her time alone in the woods that allowed her hands to grow back. And it is the healing of his fidelity that allows him now to open his heart again to both the mother and child, to take them back and remarry them. Ta-da, end of story. Okay, so it's a weird story, right? In a lot of ways, it's a very strange story. It has been classically portrayed as the story of wounding, and specifically of women's wounding. And sometimes the devil is seen in Jungian terms as the father's shadow side, if you will. I'm not a big fan of that. When I read fairy tales, I'm more of a post-Jungian, in that I think that there are archetypes that live in the world and almost have their own life independent of us. So I think it sounds too easy to me sometimes to just superimpose these these sort of facile, well, that's the bad mother, or that's my shadow side, or that's me as a child, right? Although I think we can find information for healing in this story, it's really about much more than that, I think. I mean, it is a classic heroine's journey as opposed to a classic hero's journey. Now, a classic hero's journey is generally a quest, right? Man must go out and overcome something, whack a dragon on the head, kill an ogre, that sort of stuff. That's typically, the man finds his strength and in himself and off he goes. With women's stories, and this is what's fascinating about this, is that this is both, right? This is both a man's story and a woman's story. But in a woman's story, in this heroine's journey, it's really about uncovering your depths and the depths of the connection to the natural world, which is where they both find healing, if you understand. Because not only does she find healing in the forest, he also finds his healing there when he must go in and go alone. So her initiation into adulthood comes twice, if you will, twice by being rescued, once by being rescued, and once by allowing her own healing to take place. And so in that case, the woman, the old woman in the forest, if you will, becomes sort of a stand-in for that higher self, the higher or deeper, knowing that we have. But it isn't until the king learns what it is to be a good man, recognizes that he, in fact, has done, kind of a typical masculine thing, tried to fix her, gave her the hands, but then abandoned her during a time of war. And that he must atone for that, understand it, and hold firm to it, and to his love for her, in spite of having to walk away from his kingdom. So if we're looking at this sort of a story as a framework, if you will, for any other story that we may want to write, be it about good husbands and what it means to find ourselves as women or as men, for that matter. It's important to look first, again, at the structure and the plot. Right? So the first thing we always have is an initiating incident, right? I'm sure you've all heard that before. Why is this day unlike any other day, is what my friends who are actors and scriptwriters say. Why is this day not like any other day? And I think my Jewish friends at Passover say pretty much the same thing, but another story. So first, we begin with a little what's the word I'm looking for? Exposition. Thank you. We have the miller. He really doesn't have a name. He's just a miller. There's a mother, but she's never around. And there's the girl. That's it. The devil shows up. The devil showing up. Now that's the initiating incident. That's why this day is like no other. And then the farmer, Miller, who is, he's kind of weak. And he doesn't really, he's more than willing to take money over pretty much anything. And so in classic sense, what that means is he sells his soul. Right? And then that subsequent bargain, the action begins to rise and rise and rise. What hinders the hero? How does she gain stability? How do we win her heart? And so in this story, there's several challenges, there's several crises, there's several tests, right? Will she be able to survive in the wood? Will she be able to feed off the pears? Will the king kill her if he finds her eating the pears? Will she survive his absence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And later, of course, the interference of the devil in the efforts of the husband to protect her. So then the climax, the point of greatest tension in the story, is always the tipping point, right? So we've got the exposition, we've got the initiating incident, we've got the rising drama, we have the climax of the story. In this story, it occurs when the queen must leave the king's palace. That's really the moment at which everything comes together for a second time and symbolically. And then falling action is when it happens after the climax, when she arrives in the sanctuary, in the woods, finds safety there and her own guardian angel. The resolution, in which the heroine solves the main problem that they've been grappling with throughout the story, which is she grows back her hands. Her baby son grows safely into childhood. And the denouement, the king understands what's really been going on. and comes to find his queen and takes her back home. So that, in a way, is, it's a very simple breakdown of this particular story. But if you're looking to use fairy tales, folk tales, as a way of deepening your own work, always make notes on what the structure is, because you'll find they're very similar to the structure of movies you've adored, other books you've read, and that will help give you a way to go forward. There's two types of writers. I think it's Joyce Carol Oates who says, no writer worth their salt would ever begin a book unless you knew exactly how it was ending. And then there's Margaret Atwood who says, I never know what's going to happen next. I'd hate to work in a book where if I knew what happened next, I'd be bored. And if I'm bored, you're bored. I fall into Atwood's camp, but sometimes you need the next stepping stone. And that can very often be found in that sort of a classic structure. Now, most folk and fairy tales fall into two patterns. They're either the siege narratives, in which the hero or the heroine is sort of quite static, and there's some action taken against them in one way or another, or else there's the quest narratives, and I would say that this falls into primarily it is a quest narrative. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about are archetypes, because I gave, if you were on the website, I gave you a list you can look at of what archetypes are. And, I posit that pretty much every narrative you've ever read or seen or listened to, even if they are incredibly specific characters, they also fill they fill the form of archetypes. So, how do we use an archetype? So if we look at this, we have the maiden, virgin, pure girl. Yes, we have her. We have the devil. We have the archetype of the angel. We have the archetype of the king. We have the archetype of the old lady in the woods, right? The devil, in fact, plays, I would even say, he's also desire and he's life force. So, as we always say that no villain is completely villainous. Even if you're working in a folk tale or a fairy tale, there's always that other part, right? The wolf in Little Red Riding Hood is much more than a hungry wolf, right? We don't call them wolves for nothing. There's something deeply sexual about that, the awakening of a woman in the forest. Some of the old stories are much more explicit in the old tellings of that story. But all of that can fall into any number of narratives in modern life. The mother and father in this story, the father who betrays the women in his life, and also the absent mother. There are so many absent mothers, not only in fairy tales, but in modern writing. And if they are made specific enough and whole enough, they will resonate on two levels. And I think that for me is also one of the things that's so pertinent about working with fairy tales, is that if a character comes from that place, from that deep, deep place, what you're doing with the reader or the audience is you're giving them two aspects to work from, right? So they recognize this person as being a very specific, very particular person. We always say it's written so well. I mean, God, it's a real live person on the page. I can't imagine, it was so real. I thought I knew her. But it's also reading on a deeper level, in that archetypical level that comes from a place that's almost unconscious to us, but that resonates through all the work we do and through all the things we see, right? We see an old woman in the forest, and we immediately have a bunch of associations with that. Well, that can be the old lady concierge in the bottom of my apartment in Paris. She's a gatekeeper, right? That's an archetype. I can't remember what her name was now. My husband remembers, I'm sure. But that, but she was an older lady. She was fearsome, and she guarded the gate to our, to our home. And so that made her an archetype. Now I'm just seeing, somebody is asking, could I read a passage from Why Is This Night Different from All Other Nights? Passover, yes. Could I read a passage from my book? I could, if I could find a copy of it. Maybe Ron, if he's listening to this, would bring me a copy of it. I don't have one here. I just have a whole stack of fairy books, and I could read just a little passage about perhaps when she finds Shabranka. Thanks, babe. Oh, thanks, even my reading copy. Okay, so I will, in this dark light, read just a little bit. I had not planned to, but I shall. Yes, okay. So Maggie, who runs this bookstore called the Grimoire of Kensington Market, thank you. There, look, light. She has been hiding out there since she herself got clean and sober. She has a dog named Badger, and they are just going out for their walk. At noon, Badger and Maggie took their usual constitutional along the crowded, noisy streets of Kensington Market. Opening the door was always a slightly unsettling moment. Behind the door, the world of the bookstore was hushed, calm, as though out of time entirely, and the street noises didn't penetrate. Stepping out into the world of brightly colored Victorian houses, the Wart and Willow apothecary her friend Mr. Strundale owned, riotous secondhand clothing stores, cars and taxis, drivers leaning on their horns, bicycle couriers whooshing by, coffee shops and open-air vegetable markets, which even in winter filled the air with a note of overripe fruit and decay, was a bit like stepping through the looking glass. They walked past Kensington Market's Italian pasta shops and espresso bars, Chinese herbal dispensaries, and French cheese shops. Badger trotted along. He had been rummaging through the garbage in the alleyway near the Grimoire when Maggie found him, and he'd chosen to accept her invitation to live with her. Maggie had welcomed him, malodorous and crawling with vermin, given him a bath, as much food as he needed, and her love. Now they wandered around to Bellevue Square, where Badger discreetly performed the necessary functions and then made their way back to the shop. As they neared the Grimoire's narrow door, Badger lowered his head, flattened his ears, and did a fair impression of a lion stalking something through tall grass. "What are you doing?" Maggie laughed, trying to ignore the chill up her spine. Badger stopped and growled. She followed his gaze. The sidewalk traffic looked normal. Mothers pushing strollers, people talking into phones, a man walking a schnauzer. Maggie wondered if it was the other dog that disturbed Badger, although he was generally friendly to other animals. Then she noticed a woman. She looked familiar, but Maggie couldn't place her. Her hair was a short silver halo around her head. Her gaze was downward, and Maggie couldn't make out her features other than a slash of dark lipstick. She wore a long wool coat, open, showing a man's suit, and lace-up black shoes. Something about the way she moved, the way she raised her head, the ghostly skin, wide mouth, the deep dimples, the eyes holding knowledge of some private joke. It looked so much like her, but different. "Well, what a nice little shop," the woman said. "Maggie, dear girl, how are you?" That voice, all honey and smoke, the accent something Eastern European, Ukrainian or Russian perhaps. Shabranka looked different, yes, softer somehow, but no older than when Lenny, Maggie's old boyfriend, had first introduced her 8 years ago. Maggie had asked her then where she was from, but Shabranka said it was nowhere she would know and refused to say more. "What are you doing here?" Maggie's mind spun. Shabranka, from whom everyone bought Elysium, which is the drug, knew where she lived, and she could see the grimoire. How could that be? "I heard about your loss," Shabranka said, "and wanted to say how very sorry I am." Badger growled, "Sit." Maggie said, and the dog did, although not without a reluctant little dance first. "What loss?" "Oh, dear," Shabranka said, shaking her head. "Why, Mr. must be. Of course." And I think I'll just stop it there. You got a flavor for it. So that's the initiating incident. This moment when this drug dealer, who she thought she'd avoided all these years, and managed to fool into thinking she was gone completely, arrives suddenly at her door. And of course, things are never quite the same after that, are they? Always fun when somebody shows up at your door, although nobody's doing that these days, right? So yeah, just to go back to this, I just have a few notes on the imagery in that handless maiden story. One of the things you may notice about what I wrote there's an allusion at one moment to walking through the looking glass. And that's something I did all the way through the novel, is I made references to other folk and fairy tales. One, because I think it's fun for people to pick that stuff up. Diane can't find the website, not to worry, I'll share it afterwards. One, because it's great fun, I think, for writers to go, oh, I know what she's talking about, that's from this and that's from the other thing. But also because it reinforced this idea that there were many things going on at once, and that the story was hopefully working for you on 2 levels. So that's one of the recurring themes and motifs, if you will, in that novel. When we come to back to the Handmaid's Tale for a minute, we think about the maiden, right? She's one of the symbols, some part of the imagery. So is the apple tree. The apple tree, you know, we all think of the tree of knowledge, the tree of life. I mean, it's a tree of spring. It's a tree of plenty. It's a tree of the apple and Snow White. I mean, it has all of these things behind it. So that's one. The dismemberment of her hands. This is another symbol of the book. She also, and I didn't say this when I was retelling the tale very badly, but she straps the hands to her back when she goes into the forest. And so she's taking her wound, if you will, with her. And it's not until she can lay those hands down later that she begins to heal. The pear tree, which gives her the sustenance from the king, the silver hands, her newly grown real hands, that sanctuary, all of those things. When you're reading a story like this, it's marvelous to take notes and just say, I mean, one of the things that, and it's funny, I didn't use it in the story when I was telling it to you, but this idea of her strapping the hands to her back, my God, that stayed with me when I read that story. And I kept going back to it, you know, and so finally, I keep a journal where I talk to characters in fairy tales, because why not? And I started to write about this idea of carrying this with you and strapping them to your back, and what must it feel like to have this constant reminder of that pain. And then I thought, well, don't we all do that, right? I mean, who doesn't strap their wound to their own back and then carry it around until they're ready to put it down? And how could that be worked as a symbol into a novel about someone dealing with guilt, or someone dealing with, being battered, or abused as a young person, someone being lost somewhere and never being able to put that rock that they've been carrying down with them. So as I say, when you're reading not only folk and fairy tales, but, if a book really strikes you as brilliant beyond all measure and you just can't stop reading it, it's wonderful to go back sometimes. You don't want to ruin your whole reading experience by taking notes all the way through it the first time through. But sometimes it's wonderful to go back and just go through a few passages and try and think of what those images mean to you, and why not necessarily why the author put them there, but why you pulled them out. Why have you chosen that image, right? It's quite fascinating to do that. So I think I blithered on for more than is long enough. I'd like to just offer you some ideas about what you can do with this story or other stories. And, again, making notes on those images, I think it's wonderful. I also, as I said, talk to fairy tale characters. There's something really interesting about having a written conversation with a character. So, who knows who starts off? Little Red Riding Hood starts off, right? And then you begin talking to her and asking her questions. It's quite a fascinating way to get into a character and to start sort of opening up those doors in your mind in a new way. And also this idea of the sacred wound, this binding of the hands. What's your wound? How are you carrying it? What's your character's wound? We all got one. Right? Every character you have should also have a wound of some kind. Maybe they're not even willing to admit it to themselves, but it's there. It's always there. So what is it? And how are they carrying it? And how does it manifest itself when they don't mean it to? You know, I've known people over my life, and I thought, oh, what's that about? Like, what are they reacting that way about that particular thing, whatever it is? And then later, you know, they'll tell me some story about when they were younger, and I go, oh, okay, that's, you know, that's what that was. You know, this person is still trying to protect something there, or they're still, you know, they're still prickly about that, you know, if that makes any sense to people. So yes, as somebody is just saying that an excellent book about archetypes is The Writer's Journey, The Mythic Structure for Writers. I agree it is, but it's very male-centered. I think it is a good book. Christopher Vogler, I have it, I've used it, referred to it, but I think you have to remember that it is written, it's written specifically for screenwriting, and it is, as I say, it's very much about the masculine quest. And there's been a lot of work done since about the difference between the heroine's journey and the hero's journey. So you might want to keep that in mind when you're working with that book, but it is a really good one. Thank you, Rosanna. Are there any other questions that I can answer for you? Anything you want to know? Doesn't even have to be here. Ms. Davis, did turning your personal story into a fairy tale ultimately allow you to write about it in memoir? I don't. Thank you. You know, it's a really nice question. But I never have written it in memoir. I wrote a couple of articles, like newspaper articles about it. But I've never felt the need to write about it in memoir since. I think that it fulfilled for me anything that I needed to make sense of. And I think possibly in a way that writing memoir would not have done for me. A good book on the heroine's journey. You know, I will find it for you, Pamela. And I will post it on the website. Now, Ron, I'm going to ask you, or Dawn, please, if somebody could just get me the link to the website so I can put it up here and everybody can see it.
You want the website?
Yeah, people have said, because I think they all know about the Facebook page, but I've referred to the website a couple of times, and I'm not completely sure that people know how to get there. Yeah, the other thing, sorry, go ahead, Dawn, you were popping in?
No, I just posted the
Oh, you got it. Okay, so yeah, so everybody should be able to see that there. Dawn has posted to everyone, http://journeywithin.blogspot.com.
And there is also a link on the Facebook page.
On the Facebook page as well.
On the about of the Facebook page.
Okay, so on the web page, I will try and find the book I'm thinking of on the heroine's journey, and I will post that up there. You know, the other thing I wanted to say is the first novel I ever wrote, The Stubborn Season, is also autobiographical in many ways. And there, what I did was, you know, it's about the relationship between me and my adopted mother. And she's passed on now, and she had terrible mental health problems. And I couldn't write about that in the present tense because she was still alive at the time. And also because I didn't think I really wanted to just write a story about another dysfunctional family. I was living too much of it. But putting that in a historical context, I moved the entire story to the 1930s. And that gave me the same kind of distance in a way that writing from a fairy tale place did. So that's often, it's something else you can do is if you're a bit too close to the material you're working on, you can pick it up and you can move it to a different historical setting, and that certainly helps. What have we got here? Yeah, Craig, when I read The Handless Maiden and the strapping on the back sparked a story of someone carrying a battered leather bag, the letters and artifacts of a past lost love. Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful. Beautiful. Write that. Do it. Is it Mel? Mel, you're saying it's the name of the book is simply The Heroine's Journey? That's hilarious. Was it that easy? Okay, we got that answer then. It's The Heroine's Journey. Thank you. And Maureen Murdoch is the author. Thank you very much. Baggage image. Rita, my friend, is saying baggage image, De Niro carrying high conquistador armor in the movie The Mission. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yes. Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
I think you missed a question by Robert.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Robert. In using myths, especially Greek myth, serve the same function as you. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think they're in fact, I'm listening right now to, and you might really enjoy this. It's Audible has a recording out done by the brilliant Stephen Fry called Mythos. It's not in book form. It's only in written form. He makes them come to life in a way that I've never seen before. It's amazing. It's so much fun. And Neil Gaiman did the same thing in both written and audio form for the Norse gods. But yes, I think they certainly would, because it's about getting to that that sort of ancient kernel of things. What I would say, though, Robert, is the thing about folk and fairy tales is that it's whereas the Greek gods are sort of the peak of things, right? The Olympus of things. Folk and fairy tales are sort of the common knowledge. They're peasant knowledge. They come very much from the people, the folk. And what I find very interesting about them is, whereas there's a lot of passivity, especially female passivity, in novels written, historical novels of any era, really. The same is not true of heroines in folk and fairy tales, because they were, generally speaking, even if it was the princess, these were stories written by the people. And so you often find a lot of wit, a lot of cunning, a lot of inner strength in characters there that you might not in more popular literature. So it's a different sort of knowing, it's a different kind of understanding, different kind of wisdom. And that would be my only caveat about working with, gods and that sort of mythology, as sacred mythology, as opposed to folk and fairy tales. And I'm not talking, by the way, about, Disney. I have a real burr under my saddle about Disney. One of the things that has infuriated me beyond all measure is what they did to The Wind in the Willows. The Wind in the Willows is one of my favorite books, always has been. And there is what I think one of the most deeply spiritual pieces of writing in the world in that book. There's a chapter in the original version called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, when Rat and Toad go out to look for the baby otter who has been lost overnight, and they fear that he is dead. And they find him curled up at the feet of the god Pan, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And it is this unbelievable moment of awe and terror and wonder and love. And as they walk away, they forget it, right? Because you're not supposed to live in that kind of space forever. Disney, when they republished the book, took that chapter out because it wasn't Christian. Now that just drives me nuts. That drives me out of my mind, because it really, it speaks, now Pan is a god, right? So, but not per se the Christian God, but the sense of holiness and wonder that these animals felt is something that I would wish every Christian might feel, every person of any faith might feel, regardless. And so I think the same thing sort of happens when Disney writes a lot of these old folk and fairy tales. Even Cinderella gets all mushed out of shape in Sleeping Beauty and Beauty and the Beast. It's fun for what it is, but the original tale is incredibly powerful in a very different way. How are we doing here? The new Circe novel, yes. I would like to read that too. Can you speak about the transformation aspect in fairy tales, man into deer, and how does this fit into an archetype? Okay, so transformation aspects in fairy tales it's really complicated. And I could spend an awful lot of time talking about it. But what I do feel about it is that often what characters transfer, and we think about something like the swans, right? The 12 swans. where the transformation, I'll just say this a little bit, the transformation with male characters is often a punishment, right? The evil stepmother, you know, gets ticked, as she did in the Wild Swans, and she turns the 11 boys into you know, into swans, right? And it's done out of malice. It's done out of nastiness, and the only way that they can be returned to their proper form is through the love of this virtuous sister, right? Fair enough. You find often when women are transformed, they're transformed as part of their value of goodness, or part of their power. And my mind's going entirely blank to give you an example of this, but I will find one and I will put it up on the website. So I think you will often find that the archetypes, first of all, you're dealing then with an animal guide, right? So you deal, if something is transformed into, like, man into deer, as you're asking about, there, that's also an archetype in and of itself, right? The animal helper. But if it's a deer, well, the deer is both a messenger of purity, a messenger of the wild hunt, and a victim of the hunt itself. So we have to look in context of the story to see what the transformation meant archetypically. But it's always means something. You're absolutely right, Jason. You're absolutely right. And Rita is saying another resource, the dark feminine. Oh yeah, excellent. China Galand. Yeah, the dark feminine, terrific. Oh, and Craig also has a huge fur with Disney. Philip Pullman, Dawn is saying she's read Philip Pullman's retelling of a bunch of fairy tales. Yes, he does pull out some very interesting things. Yes, and again, you know, you'll find a lot of this retelling. What's often interesting is, for example, if you look at Perkta, Brekta, and Frau Holle, who are the dark winter crones of Germany and Scandinavia, they're actually the same goddess, named in different ways. Excuse me. And there's a lot of discussion in academic circles about whether or not this is the original sort of dark goddess of the area, who got turned into a monster goddess by Christians when they came in, because she came in the middle of winter. She, you know, Frau Holle is the one who shook her eider down and it snowed, right? And she's, especially in Germany, she's been turned into a figure that comes on Christmas night, and if you've been a bad child, she rips out your innards. That's not very happy. But if we look at what the original intent of such a thing is, if someone is shamanic and they have their insides removed and replaced with something, now we're talking about a very deep shamanic ritual that is symbolic. It's figurative, it's not literal. But if there was a goddess to whom that sort of power was given, well, you know, along comes a certain variety of you know, patriarchal Christianity, and that's all very upsetting. So, you know, we have to get rid of her and we have to turn her into something terrifying. So often when you see, you know, even the Grimm tales, you can sort of see hints of things far older. For example, if you look at older depictions of Mother Goose, right? First of all, the goose is one of the sacred animals to the goddess, right? All of the duck, the swan, the goose, any animal that can go from the earth to the water to the sky is considered sacred to the goddess. And so Mother Goose, interestingly enough, if you look at very old depictions of her, she rides a broomstick. Love that part. She often has one foot that is a duck's foot turning backwards. Now, what on earth is that about, right? Where does that come from? How does that fit into Mother Goose? It's an older hint. It's an older hint that it comes from something, you know, pre-Christian, far older. And that's, you know, part of us recognizes these things. Even if we don't necessarily know them, we recognize them. So get on Google if you like, and go back and look at some of that, you know, like look at Victorian depictions of Mother Goose, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The author's name of Mythos. I can't remember who the author's name is, Robert, but it is read by the actor Stephen with a PH Fry on Audible. Yeah. As in the tale of the Gilgamesh, but well, yeah, Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is quite remarkable, isn't it? Because it's, you know, there's a very interesting moment there when, I'm going to forget it, but Enkidu is the wild man, I think, yeah? And Gilgamesh goes down into the underworld, but Enkidu has to be re-civilized. And he's re-civilized when the priestess, the woman, makes love to him. That's the way he is returned from his wildness. So there's all sorts of things. I haven't read that in a while, but there's all sorts of things in that tale, Jason, about transmigration and shifting and transformation, and what brings one to civilization from the dead to the living, from the living to the dead. How do we accept death? You could read that 100 times and still find things out of it. Hero Within 6, Rosanna is suggesting The Hero Within. Excellent. Yep, terrific book. Uses of Enchantment. Berna, somebody's asking me about Bruno Bettelheim. Well, Bruno Bettelheim, I've read the book a long time ago. I haven't read it in years. If I'm not mistaken, he was a Freudian Jungian, and I think he has a very specific take on the way children relate to fairy tales and what the symbols and fairy tales mean to children. And I remember sort of going, well, I'm not so sure about all of that, but an important book nonetheless, because it brings up an awful lot of questions, and I may be completely wrong on it. So there you go. How are we doing? Anything else? I only asked about the transformation because of the example of handless maidens transforming to get pairs. Okay, Jason, sorry, I may have stated that wrong. The angel transforms to a hind to take her across the river so she can get the pears. She doesn't transform herself, although she is transformed spiritually, and her heart is transformed, and she's got hands, but she doesn't have hands. So there are other transformations going on there. Okay. I think maybe we're wrapping on that. Would you like me to unmute you? Oh, there's a couple more. Thank you so much. I can't think of any examples of women transforming into animals. Well, there's and to do with disabling women. No, generally it's about, like, if you think of the Selkies. So the question is, I can't think of any examples of women transforming into animals. The transformation tend to have to do with disabling women. Well, but think of the Selkies, for example. Right, the Selkies are women who are seals who transform to women, generally out of love, but always wish to return to the sea where their power lies as the transformed into the animal. So that's just one example of that, and I will give you others. Oh, there's my husband again. Are like Maleficent's wings being taken? Do you know? I didn't see that. That's a Disney, isn't it? I did not see. Does anybody have thoughts on Maleficent losing her wings in what I'm sure is one of those movies? No, maybe not. Well, what do you think, Jason? Tell us. What do you think? I have unmuted you, Jason. What do you think?
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm a Warner Brothers person all the way to Bugs Bunny, but I don't Disney either. It's overwhelming. But I did see the movie, and a girl I did not know much at work just ran up and overheard me talking about it and said the fairy Maleficent's wings being taken from her was symbolic of rape. And I just thought that was crazy. But then I thought, you know, if you think about it that way, perhaps because she had no wings or anything.
No, absolutely. That was intended to be a very violent activity.
She was right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I'm not. Does that happen in the original?
No. This was definitely a Disney retelling from a slightly different point of view, from the point of view of the evil fairy.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So yes, that would be, and yeah, I mean, I think the word rape gets thrown around sometimes, but I think if you take what is a woman's soul powered from her, symbolically, kind of falls into that category, I think. And Japanese tales, Deborah says, foxes are often evil trickster women. Yes, and there's the fox wife.
Oh, yeah?
Right, the fox wife, which is a wonderful Japanese tale. So I think somebody's getting very loud there. Okay, I think we'll have to mute you all again. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll have to mute you all again. Sorry. Disney couldn't go too far because they need to sell a lot of merchandise. Yes, that's probably true. Nothing like merchandise. Speaking of which, speaking of merchandise, I must remind you that, all of the writers who will be teaching you here, we do have books and we do like to sell them. We quite enjoy that. So if you would like to go and buy a book and support us, we would certainly be grateful for that. And I think I'm going to close there now. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Now that you all have the website up, please go back to that. And I'm going to try and answer any questions you got there. If you'd like to, I think I offered a couple of writing things, sort of take a story and take a story you're working on perhaps and turn that into a fairy tale, write it as a fairy tale, see what happens. I will try and look at those and we can have a little bit of a chat. Also, this, as I said, has been recorded, so it will go up on the website as well if anybody hadn't had a chance to be here tonight, or if you like to see it again. But I really appreciate all of you coming and spending this time. I hope everybody's doing okay in what is a truly astounding and challenging and unsettling time. I was saying to somebody today, it just feels like, something's crouching out there. So there's an archetype and an image for you. But we're going to get through it. And, as long as we're healthy, we'll keep coming back here. I hope to see, I'm going to be on with Hassan on Saturday. That's going to be a really terrific session, as I think they all will be. Again, thanks very much. And I'll see you over on the website.
And
bye, everybody.
I was just going to suggest, Lauren has been good enough to put some exercises up, and it might be, an interesting activity for, if you feel like sharing your response to the exercise. Perhaps people can take a look and maybe give feedback to other members of the class. It will be, just a nice way of like communicating with each other again in this very special time.
Before you go, there's somebody who wants to say hello. And now there's my dog. This is Bailey.
He's been so well behaved.
He's been very, very well behaved. You have no idea. And he's had enough now. So I think I will say goodnight. Right? You're going to say goodnight to the people, baby? You want to? Say goodnight. Say goodnight, wave goodnight. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, and I hope we'll see you on Saturday morning.
But did I say The Handmaid's Tale? Ron says, and Handless Maiden.
Yes.
There we go. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.